Fine.
This is an experiment to see if two gentlemen who have a lot of experience in the field of therapy can have a discussion about therapy and training, which would be of interest to students and other people who are required to read our books and who are often, I think, forced into making differences between people who follow your approach and people who follow my approach. Often differences that we would never make, I think.
Yeah.
So we should have a discussion to see if we can produce a dialogue that's interesting enough for people to want to watch it. Let's begin with issues you and I are in agreement with that perhaps the rest of the field isn't, and then proceed to differences we might have, if any.
At this point, nobody that does therapy will not include certain things that you do or that I do.
Sure.
There is nobody that doesn't imitate Whitaker in some way or other. So that I think that as pioneers of certain ideas, I think it is interesting to see what happened to the new generation of people.
Sometimes to be horrified by what they do with it, and sometimes to be pleased. That's true.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Sure.
but I see much more, much less awe and respect to their elders, and much more, using whatever is useful.
Sure.
And I think that all in all is a very good development.
Well, I think there's been a change in the generation from therapists who felt they were sort of observers and objective observers of families to people who feel under pressure to produce a change, and therefore they're hungry for ideas and ways to do it these days. They're impatient with just abstractions about the nature of families, really. They want to know what to do. Because if they have a woman who vomits 5 to 25 times a day, the fact that it's interesting that she vomits, or that this may be related to something in her past, isn't their interest. It's how do you stop a woman from vomiting?
Yeah, in that, I recently had a case of a woman that vomited, and I think it was in Argentina, and when I began to explore, then I began to hear your voice. See, I began to explore how much junk food she bought and how much it cost. And then in the, while I was developing that question, I was thinking of one of your techniques of blending the food and...
that's Chloe's technique.
That's Chloe's technique. Look at that, Chloe, please. And then, well, I heard it in your voice. I don't care if it was Chloe's technique.
Well, that's the way it should be, really.
I heard it in your voice. And in the measure in which I was exploring that, then something different happened. And this approach was irrelevant. But that is some of the things that I am trying to teach people, to hear a voice, to make an hypothesis, to try it, and to change it. And one of the things that I am teaching is how not to be structural. To the horror of the people that I train, I really am beginning to think that that we serve the purpose.
Once you're structural, then you can talk about how not to be structural.
One of the things that I have been involved lately is in kind of trying to look at the things that different schools have brought that are positive and that should be incorporated, if we want, in a large pool, and the things that handicap that. I still believe in the possibility
of a merging of all the ideas coming out with the best one, you mean?
Well, no. Actually, of having a healer pouch where you can put a snake skin and feathers of chickens,
Sure.
and sheet of goals, and use it
Sure.
in the measure in which you can. This is something that I do.
You know, what I was thinking of is that how your situation has changed since I've known you. From your experience at that clinic, where you were trying to take people who didn't know anything about therapy, and certainly didn't know anything about the poor, and train them how to do therapy with the families of the poor. And if they could just get through an interview that wasn't embarrassing, I think you were pleased. That is, you were forced into absolutely practical problems, while at the same time running this fantastic clinic that was developing from 12 people to 300 in 10 years with 2 satellites and all this. And you were trying to administer that clinic and also be the only teacher, except with Braulio and somewhat with me, of that gang of people. I think what you've done is change out of that situation into a time, once you got out of it, that you can be more reflective, you can appreciate thinking, you can be more of a philosopher, so that you tend to transmit that more to students now than you used to, I think.
Well, this is an interesting thing, because, I see your changes from a person that entered into the field blasting at windmills, and in a very effective way, destroying shibboleths, and that was the kind of thing. Then you moved to a kind of an constructor of ways of doing things. That is a very different way of being. It's a very different behavior.
I went more from being a philosopher to being a practical person, and you went more from a practical person to being a philosopher.
Yeah.
And we passed in the middle there. So.
Yeah, and then you created this institution. And in creating this institution, then together with creating this institution creates you.
Sure. And I get into some of the problems you had in that institution, right?
And I move out of an institution, and then I don't have the constraints. It's very interesting in terms of how we are very much part of the context. So I change my context, and my thinking changes in geography. You change your context, and then you achieve certain constraints, and certain, not only constraints, but of course certain ways of looking that you see more clearly. See, in some way at this point, therapy is not the thing that makes me tick. I do therapy,
sure.
I enjoy it and so on, but I am not evolving new ways of doing therapy. I was reading your book. I was also reading Chloe's book, and these are books of expansion of how to do things better. While my last book has only one article about therapy.
It's a more reflective book.
Yeah.
Suppose today you were going to take over a clinic like you did in 1965, and you were going to start training the staff and so on. What would you do? How would you begin?
I really don't think I could answer that, because I am a different person with much less energy.
No, well, if you had the energy back. What I think is there are people who are starting up these enterprises. They're taking over clinics and they want to introduce family therapy.
I can only say what are the things that I consider were the most important thing that I achieved. And some of them have to do with the changing a number of institutions. First, that the clinic became a model of a modality of therapy that is probably unique in the sense that it was one child guidance clinic that was family therapy.
That's right.
There was no different modalities of working. There was not individual therapy and group therapy and so on. It was one modality.
You were a purist in that sense.
Yeah, and in that sense, it offered a model because all this staff was trained in the same way, and then many things became very simple because people accept the way of doing. If a clinic, an institution has one way of doing, then it's not questionable. If a department of a large organization is doing something, then it can be questioned. So that there was a lot of things that became quite simple.
You know, I remember a transition. I have a visual image of before you arrived, what they used to do is have a child psychiatrist play with the child and the social worker see the parents. And I remember walking behind a one-way mirror when I got there. And sitting up was the social worker talking to two parents. And sitting over in the corner was a child psychiatrist playing with the child. They put it all in one room as a first step to finally having one person deal with the family. So it didn't happen suddenly when you took it over. It took some real effort.
Well, the first 3 years were years of tremendous struggle because the institution had a particular way of working, and I was going to introduce a different way of working, and it was necessary to join the staff. And I joined the staff, and the staff left me, so that fortunately a lot of the staff left me so that I could begin to work. But, you know, one of the things was the development of one institution. The other thing that I feel very good was that this institution entered into a kind of collaboration with another institution that was Children's Hospital and introduced an awareness about families in the pediatric field that
more than the psychiatry department back then.
Absolutely. No, we didn't touch the psychiatric department at all. Psychiatric department was continuing doing their psychiatric things, and we were developing with Children's Hospital and family pediatrics. So I think that historically the big contribution of the child guidance clinic will come in the end as the psychosomatic work, and the change on a way of conceptualizing pediatric illness. I think that this will be very, it is one of the things that I assume will tend to generalize more than the construction of another institution like the child guidance clinic that is family-oriented. So that.
Well, you made a brave try to define in child psychiatry the family approach as the approach of child psychiatry, and the other approaches like play therapy is deviation. But I think the Child Guidance Clinic in Philadelphia is still the only place that's a family-oriented child psychiatry place, isn't it?
I don't know.
I don't know if
I really don't know. But to me, it was a struggle to define child psychiatry as family therapy, as family psychiatry. That is my definition.
You know, there's another thing that you did that I always appreciated, and it's not common, is many places who are trying to introduce family therapy are trying to be respectable at the same time. And they say, well, let's also have individual therapy, and let's also have group therapy, so we won't antagonize anybody. And then we'll do family therapy as well. And what they do is they end up, and it's just like it always was.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to take a purist position and say the rest of it is out, this is the way to work, in order to reorganize the intake process, the therapy process, the termination process, the record keeping, everything changes, really.
Really, when I am looking at, back, I don't know how I got the guts to do that.
It was extraordinary, really.
Yeah, it was probably a kind of contrary attitude that I had all my life. I learned through opposition.
Well, it was partly that, but also it was also that there were certain people who recognized that this was a revolution in the way of thinking. Don Jackson was the one who did that. In 1957, he resigned from the Analytic Association, moved the couch out of his office, took up families absolutely. And I remember he attended a meeting in San Francisco. The group therapists asked for a meeting of the family therapist and the group therapist because, after all, we're all the same. Because we all work with groups, family groups or artificial groups. And they had, several hundred people in that room, and very prominent people in the group therapy. And they asked Jackson to speak. And Jackson stood up and said, I don't think there's any relationship whatever between family therapy and group therapy. Yeah. In families, you deal with changing people who have an ongoing relationship with each other. In group therapy, you're changing individuals. And he said, and I don't think group therapy has ever come up with a theory of any interest. And I don't believe it ever changed anybody. And then he took off and discussed family therapy. But to say that, to take that purist position with that crowd of almost entirely group therapists, and that was the kind of a position he took. It's got to go all the way this way, and that's it.
Well, there was something very exciting about the development of the clinic in this period.
It was an exciting place, yeah.
And I was convinced that I was right.
I think you were.
So that was very
We
good.
at least agree on that. You're right.
Yes, so that, and then after that, there was this struggle, and I remember tremendous problems. And I think that it also produced the possibility of a core of people that felt united in the development of this program. The sense we are persecuted, creates also a core.
Surrounded by Arabs in a way.
Yes,
right, yeah.
Yes, it was.
But it was also the time. There was such a crusading idea of doing something for the poor that came into it. There was also the Vietnam War. And I remember the staff, largely led by Neil Daniels, walking off with their banners in the anti-war crusade.
It was a political group. It was a very committed group that had political ideas and ideas of involvement in social issues. So that family therapy was part of that.
It was part of the time in a way.
Yeah.
I don't think we've discussed here. I recall what you did when Martin Luther King got shot. We all gathered in the clinic feeling sad and worried about that whole black community, and Martin Luther King had been shot. And you said, I want every staff member to go to every school and have a discussion with the students of the significance of this event. And everybody thought this was pretty bizarre, and they were uncomfortable, but they went. And it was a tremendous success when they came back.
Yeah.
And I remember, some were scared to go, and I remember one of them came back and said, a kid said to me, I'm scared, some black kid, because if they can shoot Martin Luther King, think what they could do to me if they come in this neighborhood. I mean, he was scared of what's happening out in that world. That hadn't occurred in a funny way. Everybody was thinking the black community would be up in an uproar about it when they were really scared. At least a lot of those kids were. But I don't think those kids had a chance of a sensible discussion of the significance of this event ordinarily in their classroom. And when you sent the staff in there, it did it so nicely.
Well, to me, it was the kind of thing that we did when Kennedy was shot. That was then one went to the schools and talked with the children about the fears and so on. So it seemed natural that one should do it when...
I didn't know there was a precedent, that's it.
Yeah. What happened is that we were afraid of the effect of a white staff in the black community.
Sure.
And so that, the reaching for another example in which a white was killed and so on, was needed to override the fear. These were very difficult periods.
Oh boy. I remember you dealing with the black members of that board that you put on the board, and the insults you took, and you were so patient with everybody. And I remember that scene when they were going to burn my film, those young black girls made that film, and the black people in the community who were organized said they wanted that film burned because it showed black life that way, which was what the girls showed, was their life.
Well, why don't you describe that better?
It was a research project in which young people, black and white, and middle class and poor, were given movie cameras and taught to use them, and just allowed to film anything they wanted to film, to see how did they perceive the world. What would they put on film about how they perceived the world? And this group of girls from that neighborhood wrote a play. One of them wrote the script, and they all acted in it, in which a young lady gets pregnant and her mother expels her from the house. They have a big fight and all this. And the girls go off and have a pad and drink. And they acted, they wrote this, they filmed it, and without any guidance from me except how to work the camera. They then put titles on it, they put music on it. They've done a wonderful job, really. I still have that book.
You have it?
Yeah. And then they showed it to the staff, expecting the staff to be so pleased. And the black staff looked at the reality of those girls' life, and they were horrified. And they said, that film can't be shown, and it's got to be destroyed. And they came to me and said it had to be burned that day. And I said, we wouldn't burn that film. It's up to the girls what they do with their film. And certainly we weren't going to burn it. And we had a discussion. Then they were going to burn the clinic.
You remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. And I remember you just took a position. Obviously you weren't going to burn that film. And we went through quite a struggle. And out of that, I remember they brought the mothers of the girls in to see the film. And the mothers were rather pleased with the film. And that the girls could do as well with music and titles and all this.
The mothers were pleased with the fact that the girls had been competent and produced something.
Right.
They were not involved in the symbolism, they were involved.
Right.
This was the product of their daughters.
Right. And then they were caught between the militants in the community and their daughters, who the daughters wanted to keep that film, the militants wanted to destroy it, and the mothers were uncertain where to go with this.
But they came defending the right of their daughters to control the film and to maintain it.
And to make a decision where it would be shown and how it would be shown. Yeah.
What happened then? Was the film shown in any place?
It was shown in the clinic, the only place. And maybe the young man who did his PhD on this with me, he showed it at Temple, I'm sure, to the communication department probably, because it was part of his research work. But it was never shown out in the community anywhere, no. I mean, that was never intended to. It was really just the girls doing this for a little research project. It wasn't to be distributed. And we did do it with poor white girls, and we did it with middle-class black and middle-class white.
That was after, or this was before the paraprofessional training program?
Yeah, before.
Yeah, and so the clinic then did not have a large black professional staff. It was mostly white, and we had Peoples was one of the black professional people that came. He was a community organizer and organized the community against us.
That's right.
That was.
But I remember how patient you were with them, and it was infuriating, some of the insults they were making about the clinic, when the clinic was one of the few places doing anything for them.
You know,
in that neighborhood, of course.
The patience was the product of the wish to maintain this institution. You know,
oh, sure. That was part of your responsibility.
One of the things that now you know is how much crow you need to eat if you are directing an organization.
That's right. Oh, yeah.
You know, it is you accommodate, and you accommodate, and you accommodate.
Oh, it would have been easy just to get indignant and throw the whole thing aside, sure. But that was a time when there was trouble everywhere. It's remarkable how the poor have gone out of fashion now, and there's not an issue anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't even get a grant now to deal with the poor. Nobody would be interested.
No, probably you wouldn't get a grant today. No.
One of the things I'm curious about, what do you think are the odds that the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic will subside back into the way it was before you entered the scene?
Well, you see, this is something that I think I had seen in institutions. You know, I went to London to the Tavistock, an institution that had a glorious past of innovation. And then it moves in and out, and it becomes traditional establishment, not defending anything, not creating new things, just maintaining itself, so that I am not really at all concerned for the survival of institutions. Question is, do these institutions develop, do they export ideas? You know, do these ideas become then spread in other places? This is a seed, and where does this seed comes? And that is something that it's clear to me. You know, when you talked about do we have students that transcend ourselves, I really think yes, you know. But then not in the form and in the way in which we sometimes would like it. You know, so that...
That's true.
I think that most of your ideas in family therapy have influenced other people that do it very differently. To me, that is students that transcend you. Maybe they are discrete people, or maybe people that don't have much to do with you, and take it and change it.
What I'm thinking of is if that place subsided back into a traditional child psychiatric clinic, it would be because the larger system is more powerful than any individuals who intervene to change it. That, I mean, there's a large influence of child psychiatry generally on a clinic like that where you're working with children. There's the influence of the hospital. There's the influence of having an inpatient unit that begins to determine a lot of decisions.
Yeah. In general, I think that the clinic will remain a family-oriented clinic because it has developed a kind of an organic cohesion, the clinic and children's hospital, in which the research about family pediatrics remains a very important...
It's become part of a larger system. And
yes, and this is a very important contribution that the clinic and the children's hospital are continuing to do in the field.
Sure.
So that, and in the measure in which family medicine becomes an ally of family therapy, then I think that this is a very, you see, if we are talking about where, how will family therapy spread in the medical profession, and how will it change the way in which medicine is being conducted, it is through the alliance of family therapy and family medicine and family pediatrics. I think that this is a possible direction of change, not through the Department of Pediatrics, not through the Department of Psychiatry, but through the Department of Medicine. And that's why I think that the particular work with psychosomatic is an important work.
well, there's also the larger issue that if you wanted to change the way therapy is, you should go to the insurance companies, because they determine so much about who's going to be a patient, how long they're to be treated.
Absolutely. The entrance for change really depends very much on sources of funding.
And I think that's true of theories. I think a theory for private practice is necessarily a different theory than for an agency in therapy. I mean, in private practice, having been in it myself, I know that you really need to have a theory that therapy takes a long time, that people have to be seen regularly, and that if you're working in an agency with a fast turnover and doing brief therapy, you really need a different theory. It looks like, in 2 or 3 different places have found this, that seeing people once a month is about as effective as seeing them once a week, which was an arbitrary selection to begin with, to see people once a week. And that begins to be a problem for practice, that if you can be just as effective once a month.
The general practitioner model has the advantage that the therapist is being carried as an image with the family, and it's used in whatever way it is because he's there. So that the advantage of the general practitioner model is the sense of continuity. Even though you have brief therapy,
sure,
you have a sense of continuity. The therapist is incorporated goals, rules, epistemology, a number of things come with symbols. The therapist remains as a symbol. And I think that this is useful.
Base for people to sort of imply, if we don't get along, we'll have to go back, or I'll call them. Or there's somebody out there.
They're so good, at implementing almost anything. And families are so pliable, really. I don't think families are resistant. I think families do whatever we tell them.
Oh,
if we tell them,
whatever we say is the appropriate thing to do, they believe that's the appropriate thing to do.
No, I think that, let me qualify that. If we know how to do it, I think that it's true that when you tell a family or a family member to do certain things, they do it. But one of the things that people do not know is what are the steps by which you convince them to do that.
But they are very well, people are, because if you could get thousands and thousands of people to lie on a couch and talk to some guy behind them year after year and pay money, you can get people to do anything, really. As long as you present it as this is a reasonable, appropriate procedure that we have found to be the best one, and so on. And I think a lot of people are able to do that. I remember a funny case. That father whose wife was in a mental hospital somewhere, and he had 3 adolescents who just insulted him in the room. They called him names, said he was an idiot, swore at him. And he said it was all the fault of his wife in the mental hospital. And you're in the room with him, and you said to the kids, you can behave this way perhaps at home, but here in this room,
yes,
you treat your father with respect, and you don't insult him.
I remember that.
Those kids started to behave themselves.
Yeah.
And at one point, one of the kids insulted the father, and the father said, "You don't behave like that in this room." But what struck me about it was you had absolute confidence that if the kids refused to go along with it, you'd be able to handle it.
Yeah.
And they immediately obeyed and did what you said.
Yeah. And clearly, then what I did not describe in any of my writings is the particular way in which I feel. I feel at which point I reach a threshold that I should not cross. It is this dependency on feedback that organizes my confidence. I know that I'm continuously reading these people. And so that in the measure that the only possible way for me to enter and work with violent people is if I know that they will not be violent with me. So
you have to read that.
You read faces, you read movements.
But I've thought about, I watched you do that, and I've taught students when a kid misbehaves in the room to just say, here, I don't want you to be disrespectful to your mother. I want you to speak properly. And what I realized is that I have students do that who wouldn't know what to do if they didn't get cooperation. Somehow they get the cooperation, the kid straightens out. I'm impressed with how much work we do teaching students to say to the family how they like them to behave. Because on the assumption families don't know how to behave in therapy. That I want you all to take turns talking, and I want you to have a reasonable conversation, and let's try to get an understanding of this problem. And then families know that you don't want them to have a fight or get all emotional or whatever they might think you want it for. They're told But I think some kids are disrespectful for the parents because they think that's what they're supposed to do in the room.
Yeah.
And just being told not to, they stop it.
But you know, from where is that students don't know that it's possible to do that? I remember Maury Bowen in an interview that he did in the clinic, and he would say to people, I don't want you to feel, I want you to tell me how you think. He was very direct about that, and people, they would stop saying, I feel, and the people would begin to say, I think. So the directiveness is something that it's very much part of the family therapy way of dealing with people.
Well, once it began to be accepted that the therapist organizes the conversation and how it's to be conducted, then it's only a problem of teaching therapists how to do that. But there's still a number of schools where they don't assume that's the therapist's task, really. There's more of an assumption that the therapist has to go and respond with whatever the family brings. And then they get into helter-skelter sort of session. But you know, there's another difference with our approach and the Milan group. I think one of the reasons the Milan group was popular is because many therapists are afraid to go into a family alone. They like company. And they either like co-therapy or a team. And the Milan group offers a team so that you're with a group doing something. And the individual responsibility of the therapist feels less, I think. And I think that was made it very popular in a number of places.
It is less.
It is less, that's right.
It is less. The therapist feels the support of the group.
But if we think of what we share in agreement, in contrast to others, we really put an emphasis on one therapist working alone, I think. We put an emphasis on changing people within the interview as well as with directives afterwards. Mm-hmm. We don't assume that if people understand their problems and why they have them, they'll change. We assume it's our obligation to change people, that we're not neutral observers of their plight. So there's a variety of issues.
I think
we assume the hierarchy in the organization is important and has to be dealt with.
We also deal with comfort, with constructing realities and assuming that the reality is a perspective, and therefore we deal with partial realities that at sometimes we called what manipulation of realities, but I prefer much more the concept of partial realities that is true for everybody.
Certainly on the emphasis on how every memory of the past is a reconstruction and that those are malleable so that people can have better past than they're now suffering with. But
so
you can do the same thing with the present.
So then we are experts, or we become experts in constructing for people a reality that is useful, like cards of identity, or like Erickson providing people with a past that they did not have. We provide a kind of an plausible, coherent reality.
For achieving whatever the goal they have.
Yeah, and I think that it is there that our artistry, the individual artistry of the therapist enters, because you need to provide a reality that is convincing. You cannot just give them a reality and say, try it. So it is how one weaves their language, their metaphor, their past, their orientation toward the future, and nonetheless we provide with a coherent possibility that people buy, and that we buy as a significant tool without thinking that this is the total reality of the family.
No, I can give you an example. We had a few weeks ago of this. It was a young woman, anorectic, who was 29, just turning 30, and had been anorectic all her life. And the therapist, Marcio Ortiz, began to emphasize that the age of 30 is such a threshold in a woman's life, that everything that has gone before is different from what happens from the age of 30 on. And by the time she had discussed this woman was becoming 30, and in the 20s she was an anorectic. In the 30s she had to be concerned about having children, getting her periods back, developing herself in her life and her career, which is so different from a woman in the 20s. Actually, she was doing exactly the same thing, but the whole thing was being reframed, restructured, and in a way that was perfectly true. The woman was entering her 30s.
And that when I work on that thing, for instance, developing the idea that 30 is a metaphor that I will build, create intensity, and so on. The wonderful thing that happened to me is that then everything that is told, it becomes kind of hooked into that concept.
Sure.
And so one of the things that happened to me is that I don't hear many other things that gives me a tremendous freedom. I trust myself that once I have a metaphor, this metaphor will guide me.
And you have to have that confidence in your own judgment. That's right. One of the things I think that was the worst aspect of training 20 years ago was everybody was taught to mistrust themselves, that they had an unconscious full of unfortunate, hostile things, and they should watch out for it. And then to be put in with a patient where you have to trust your own judgment, your own ideas, your own impulses. I think it made it very difficult 20 years ago.
But I think that this was related to the search for a truth that existed. And we accept today, it's a very different view of people.
That's true.
And of the therapist, because then, we need to accept the fact that the therapist is using his artistry, his poetic metaphors. We are not at all involved in a scientific process, at least I don't see it.
No. It's certainly an artistic process.
I remember how impressed I was when I saw Erickson's in a videotape. And for the first time, I heard his language as a very poetic language. I never had realized his language had such a poetic force.
That's because he used metaphors so in such complex.
But you see, in the reading, it didn't come across. It came across, and I said to myself, if I would be in contact with this benign old uncle that has such penchant for poetic metaphors, I would like to go into this world that he built for me.
Sure. It's certainly an artistic process, and it's one where if we could learn how to teach it, that's the hardest thing to teach as the therapist, to be artistic and innovative. You can teach the procedures.
Well, in that, you see, we had a difference in our training, in the way in which we were training, because there was a time in which I thought I could teach it, see, and I remember my entering into the room and trying to teach people. This was the period of the alphabet of skills,
Sure.
In which there was an alphabet, and if people could learn this alphabet, then they could really create their epics and their rhapsodies and everything. And we used to teach that, we used to hammer people with this alphabet. I think that you had a very different approach in that. I think that during the period in which, the early periods in which I was teaching, I was using myself as a model, and at this point I absolutely changed. I really am paying much more attention to the therapy style than I did before, you paid attention to the therapy style much from the beginning, I think.
Partly because I wasn't doing it myself, so I couldn't use myself as a model, and maybe part of why it was. But you know, there was also, I always felt you had to teach a fault. You know, it's like acting in a way. That you can teach an actor how to walk across the stage and how to say his lines. And he can do that and get by. But he hasn't really created anything or the part. But if you give him the basics and he has any potential, then he'll develop that. But if you don't give him the basics, then he can't develop the potential because he doesn't have the basic structure to work from. And it may be that some of this is something that people come with to begin with. You remember how Braulio used to, when we were training the people from the community, and we had to, in an hour's interview, judge whether to put $100,000 into this person in the training, and years of work. We would try to figure out how to figure out in an interview would this person become a good therapist or not. And I remember Braulio's little test that he did. He would say to the person, suppose you have a woman come in whose son is a bedwetter, and you talk to her about her life and so on, and you find out that that someone in the family has a motorcycle that has a leak in the gas tank. How would you make use of that in the therapy?
I never knew that.
And he was interested whether they would put together the bedwetting and the gas tank and what they would come up with in solving that leak, you know. And he would, if they could connect it at all, really, he had a chance. If they said, well, I don't know what a motorcycle, you know, then they would be into a different problem. But it may be that some people have that ability, you know, and then those are the ones we should select, or maybe it can be taught. It's hard to say.
I had learned that the only people that I felt that I thought I could select were the people that I liked, you know.
That's right. That's how we chose. We could get along with them for a year.
Yeah,
I remember thinking that.
That. One criteria that I developed recently that is that I don't accept anybody that is only in private practice.
Only in private practice.
I absolutely, and that happened to me without thinking. I began to realize that I am interested in not in training family therapists, but in changing the field. And that really what I want to do with the training is not to train family therapists, but to change the field. Therefore,
that's a certain grandiosity in that point of view.
You know, I had always been grandiose. This is one of my most simpatico kind of things. I am grandiose. And I think that, but you know, it's also part of my pessimism. I am concerned about the fact that after 30 years of being in the field, what we had succeeded is in training family therapists and not in changing institutions. And the question is, can we, or maybe we can't, you know. I think that one of the issues that I had been concerned and talking with people is, listen, the field had been successful in creating its demise because in New York, that is a city that you love and where I live, you know, the people in power remain people unaffected by any epistemological change.
Sure.
So
it's true of most large cities. Where the traditional way is entrenched in a large city, it's almost impossible to change.
You know, establishment and established institutions and the defense of the established institutions permeate pretty much the geography of the country.
But if you take New York, Chicago, There's just almost no influence of family therapy. In New York, there's, thousands of therapists. You'd think there'd be 50 family institutes there.
Yeah. Well,
You'd think there'd be 50 behavioral institutes there, with all the therapists there are in New York.
For instance, it is interesting that the country where family therapy has grafted more easily and had expanded more powerfully is Italy.
That's true.
How did it grow there? It grew because it was supported by two important political movements, the Communist Party and the Catholic Church.
That's right.
Yeah.
Both of them came together with it.
Yes, that in one. And because therapy, as providing therapy for people was not established. There was just inpatient biological
There was biological psychiatry.
And psychoanalysis for a very, very small group of people.
Right. They had no power, really.
So in this vacuum, then it spread. Here, one needs to change so many things.
I remember in Italy talking with the Cancrini about how they could jump from a biological psychiatry to a family therapy without having to go through the whole struggle with psychodynamic ideas and so on, because they just weren't there.
Yeah, it was relatively simple.
Let's take a break for a minute, get some coffee,
Okay.
and then go into training, maybe.
Yeah, let's find out.